types of relationships are being built. And it's very fast moving, right? So I think, let me just say, and we'd have to pick a country so I can talk about it more specifically than sort of generalities, but within any place, I think you are going to see the boundaries move, and you've already seen that. Well, I'll use Visa as an example. Visa was a traditional card program manager, the biggest payment company in the world, right? And they've already made two pretty strategic acquisitions, which are going to support their mobile payment vision, and that is PlaySpan and CyberSource, right? So they already made those, and I would assume that they're going to make more acquisitions in the future. So that's a traditional actor deciding that they want to move faster than organic growth and buying companies. And Amex announced today they bought Symmetrics, and before that they bought Serve, which used to be called something else. So you're seeing this kind of boundary moving, right? But it's still early days. I mean, think about I wanted to say that the mobile payments will be really big because it will start to replace what we do today in other ways. Like, so what we might use a card for today will become, or might use a check, may become mobile in the future, will most likely become mobile. But in addition, you have a huge opportunity with cash replacement because you still have about $7 trillion a year today in the world transacting over cash, and it will replace cash. So we're at the beginning of the definition of that market globally. So I think it's almost a mistake to think the game's going to be over in 12 or 18 months. I think it's going to take time for this to unfold, and it's going to unfold differently in different parts of the market. So I don't think that we are going to see some acquisitions, we're going to see some mergers maybe, but I think it's going to be pretty fluid for a couple of years as this whole thing unfolds. And I don't want to be, other people may disagree.
Actually, I have another question. So one discussion that's going on is around mobile wallet. The thing is, how do you see the adoption in US, especially as to where you can use this wallet? Whether point of sales getting NFC enabled, other places, the adoption of that, and how do you see that go?
Good, because I was going to tie to this too. This is a chicken and egg problem, right? I mean, all of us are dealing with adoption by consumers and then adoption by merchants, right? There's, to your point about where the value is, let's say, in this very complex ecosystem, from a consumer's point of view, I care about two things. First one is trust. Who do I trust? I mean, someone that I can trust. If I'm talking about financial transactions, things like security data, pushing money around, whether it is debit, credit, doesn't matter. The fact that I have a relationship with someone that I trust being my wallet presupposes trust. So that's the one aspect. And the second aspect is convenience. I could trust someone, I could trust Nirav. But, the fact that Nirav can vouch for me doesn't count at Starbucks. They may or may not know him. So most merchants, the fact that Nirav knows me and I trust him and he trusts me doesn't mean anything. So the second one is convenience, and therefore, ubiquitous adoption. Things like the value of a Visa or a MasterCard or an Amex on your card is that that just by having that, regardless of which bank may be the one that you personally trust, having that logo there also means it's going to be adopted. So these are two kind of balloons that have to kind of go up at once. So when we're debating here whether it's NFC or carrier or this or that, in the end you kind of have to have both. The battle on the carrier versus bank side is, who's got the trust and who's kind of custodian of cash, and therefore how is it easy to close a transaction on that side? The maybe in some ways more interesting battle, at least in some of these, as you say, developed geographies like the US, is who's going to create the ubiquitous adoption. You get a lot of people who've been very successful on the virtual goods side that are trying to extend into the real world retail side. You got Google and all the NFC guys that are trying to, through devices, chips, or what have you, to solve in parallel the security problem as well as the adoption by companies like Vivotech that are shipping 1 million devices and therefore hopefully reach critical mass soon enough. And you've got the question of the developed markets where even the notion of a banked customer or one that has a credit card or ascribes value to a Visa may not be frankly relevant. So it's a complex world, and I totally agree that this is not going to be...
We can get people's take. So when do we see NFC in the US as mainstream?
Now. Now in McDonald's and cabs in New York, and soon to come everywhere.
So the way we see it is that point-of-sale terminals turn over about every 2 to 3 years. And you would know this as you're an investor in one of them, but they absolutely are incorporating alternative NFC payments into their terminals. Google has already said they're launching all of their phones with NFC. iPhone 5 is going to come out with that. So that's another 18 months of people turning over their phones. I'm not sure how often iPhone users turn over, but generally speaking, mobile phone users are 12 to 15 months. So you'll see another turn on that. That infrastructure will be set. So 2 to 3 years, that'll absolutely be in place. And there's different research analysts and reports that say this will take 2 years, this will take 4 years. So roughly in that time, the infrastructure will be ubiquitous, is my guess. From there, it's to your argument, why is a user going to adopt this? So is it convenience? Is it less cost? Is it that I don't want to carry cash in my wallet? I want to, is it easier to do this than to swipe my card? Probably not, but like, is there a value, back to this question over here, is maybe the merchant knows my location, maybe he gives me loyalty. There was a great video with Google Wallet today talking about how they're adding loyalty and location and all this so that they allow the merchants to know where you are and provide value-added incentive. Basically like, this is an interesting way to buy something as opposed to a way to buy something. Okay, then I'll use that. So I think that's when you'll start to see consumer adoption occur. So so the infrastructure I think will be in place over the course of 2 to 3 years, but then you'll have to find unique ways to get users to adopt this, and I think that's going to be the catch.
Can I add a follow-on to that? So one of the unique ways of adoption is also software developers and other company developing applications
which consumers can use in multiple different ways, which across the board. Now, if you look at traditional carrier-based payments, there's 50% to 60% you're giving away margins. So what is really left for a software developer or any company to look at how you actually do that?
It's going way down.
Is it going way down to almost like a Visa, like 2.5%?
So let me just add to the two questions, the adoption question and I think you are more leaning towards the acquisition, what the M&A opportunity is. So I think they're very related. So adoption, I think, as Andreas mentioned, it's a chicken and egg, and what we call this business is a two-sided business. So one side you have the merchant, one side you have the consumers. When I started my company and we had a consumer wallet, we struggled with the same exact question, which is, where am I going to get adoption? Will the merchants come first or will consumers come first? Looking back last 15 years, and we studied all the companies in the space and how did they solve the problem, we've come to believe that it's the merchant acceptance that drives first the adoption. So when you have a two-sided payment platform in the payment business, you first have to get merchants on the board. If you look at PayPal's success, when PayPal started, they didn't have the 5 million, 10 million consumers adopting PayPal. What started PayPal and really got them on the trajectory was that the eBay merchants, the sellers, they started displaying that we accept PayPal, and then people like you and I, when we wanted to buy from that seller, I want to buy from this seller and I would like to try this method instead of giving away my credit card to this unknown seller, and then you created an account of PayPal, and that's how PayPal got the consumer adoption. But the first adoption came with merchant. If you look at Visa, when they started 50 years back, the founder Dee Hock, when he put together this whole association network, he got first merchants on the board. So what's happening even with NFC is, with companies like VivoTech, that Andrea's on the board, portfolio company, that's getting adoption with the merchants. So it will take a few years before that adoption will happen. Even in our case, what we did is we went to the Facebooks of the world and all the application developers like the Zillas and the Platums of the world. They first adopted us, and the consumers discovered us through that merchant. So that's just a piece of advice if you're stuck in that same issue around what comes first. From an acquisition standpoint, I think you were asking a question around who will buy who. I think, as Carol mentioned, the whole ecosystem is changing. In the last 50 years, this four-party system worked. I would kind of redraw the ecosystem from a different standpoint and a little bit more from a technology, and I would call it the core and the edge. And if you start with the core, which is where all the processing networks are, so that's where you have the real processing happening, which is at the very center of a transaction. So the bank transactions happening or Visa enabling the transaction. So you have the processors, which is like the credit card processors, and the banks at the core of the network. And then those transactions are being settled to the merchant. So the next outer ring for those processing networks is the merchants. And between those merchants and the processing is always there's going to be middlemen, some kind of an acquirer who's building a business like First Data of the world, who are helping you get the acquirers, who are helping you get the merchants. And then from the merchant onwards, there's a bunch of different application layers. So people like the Google wallets of the world or the ISIS wallets, they're all different applications. And then you have the consumer in the final ring, where consumers are using the applications, and those applications are helping them enable purchases at the merchants, and those merchant transactions are getting processed by the core of the network. So what is happening from an innovation standpoint is most of the innovation is going to happen over the next few years on the edge of the network rather than the core of the network, because the core plumbing is already built. And generally, for startups, it's very similar to the wireless business, that it's very hard to build the core plumbing of the payments. It's billions of dollars, and it requires a lot of trust. So all the applications that we are seeing in the market today, or all the innovation like Google Wallet, it's essentially nothing but a wrapper on the top of a Visa or a MasterCard. PayPal, if you look at even the last 10 years of success, really what PayPal is nothing but a wrapper on Visa and MasterCard or your bank account. You put your Visa card or your bank account, and that becomes your PayPal account. So, and that is basically a cool application that is providing convenience and trust online. You're going to see the similar level of innovations. And from an M&A standpoint now, if you look at this new ecosystem, the acquisitions that are going to happen in those adjacent space where, someone is overly dependent on the other party there, and they want to cut down the risk, and they want to have a bigger piece of the margin, then they're going to acquire them.
I have a question for you. Comparing the mobile wallet market to, say, the Visa and MasterCard model, right? There are many players probably in this area today. That's just the innovation phase, right? Everybody's trying to do something or the other in getting this thing going. But in the longer term, what do you see? Do you see a fragmented market sort of sustaining itself with a ton of players? Or do you see it consolidating or different from, say, the credit card payments vendors today?
I'll quickly give my views and then I'll let other people talk about it. But I think eventually in any market that you see, there is a consolidation. There is always top 3 players that emerges. And I think we are still a few years away from that. So the good news is that I think there is still a lot of opportunity for a lot of players to bring innovation to the market, and then ultimately whoever gets the adoption, whoever gets the traction, I think they will stick the top 3 or 4. Now in mobile payment and mobile wallet, it's still hard to kind of say that it will follow the same pattern, because as we talked earlier, it's a very specific solution. Like Kenya uses a mobile wallet, or some part of Africa is using a mobile wallet which is so much application specific for that geography, for that demographic, that they will survive and thrive and in that particular market. India will have a different mobile payment player. Same thing in the US. And then here you will have a Google wallet, you'll have an Apple wallet, you will have an ISIS wallet, you'll have a Visa wallet, you'll have a MasterCard wallet, you'll have a Citibank wallet. So I think over the next, you'll have an Amazon, so Facebook wallet. So what's going to happen is, I think the interesting thing is that over the next few years, the consumer is going to win, because consumers will have a lot of choices, right? And if really, I trust my Citibank account, then I'm going to do all my transactions with Citibank. The underlying protocol and the plumbing doesn't change at the point of sale, because it's basically PayWave or NFC. But my consumer application I'm going to use, which I trust, and which is most convenience.
Let me just differentiate maybe one aspect which may be different. Because it's true, all of us have multiple credit cards. I have probably, I don't know how many, but I only use 1 or 2 in my wallet. I have another 5 at home and whatever. And even of the ones I have in my wallet, I probably have 1 that I use the most for whatever reason. So there's this element of there will be a number, and people will use preferences based on loyalty points, this, that, the other. The difference I see with this being that it's not all about the plumbing and the convenience, but it's also about the point I made earlier about the value of information in context, is that I think there are some network effects that may lead to maybe larger consolidation, at least for some of the players in the middle, than the equivalent of just a payment process in the offline world, that after all just kind of create line items on a bill. And those will have to do with understanding of behavior, again, the marketing aspect of it, and frankly, the convenience to the consumer. Things as simple as electronic receipts. We're talking about convenience. What's the reason for me not to pull into cash and maybe use my, let's say, NFC thing? Well, if I know I never have to worry about ever keeping a receipt again, right? If I have a way of maybe automatically saying this is business, this is personal, like all in one place. That's convenience that, could lead to wanting to have all things in one place, above and beyond, the fact that I like my, Visa more than my Amex or whatever. Things like value, loyalty, the ability to correlate behavior across multiple merchants in a way that brings me more value, may make me as a consumer more likely to want to consolidate my behavior in the same way that a lot of us, I bet, that travel a lot, go out of their way to find the flight with the network partner that they know they're going to get perks on versus the other one, even though it might be just as convenient, right?
So there's ways to differentiate. It sounds like, in fact, you named
an interesting point you brought up was what if this business doesn't consolidate? So a big issue they're having in Japan right now is that it's too segmented. So what's going on is there's 3 major NFC providers, Suica, Passmo, and the other one's forgot. And then there's different POS players. And so for Suica, you can pay with this POS on this taxi, and for Passmo, you can pay at this Starbucks, but you can't pay at that Starbucks. And so what's becoming now is a big problem with consumer adoption, where the consumer just says, why would I use this? But the coolness, which is back to what you're also saying, is, wow, I can keep all these different things. So e-money in Japan now is 2% of all cash transactions. That's pretty interesting. Like, so if you go to Family Mart, you can actually just buy a Family Mart card and put it on your phone, much as Starbucks does. So you have all these options now to actually check out. But the infrastructure is so fragmented, it's not unified, that it's causing adoption issues. And so that's the big risk that we run into. And the last thing I'll say is, you have hit upon a very interesting time in society where, like, currency's going to go to e-currency. So it's along this whole idea of really virtual currency, and everyone will have a virtual currency, right? So my niece is 14, and I was back hanging out with her over the summer, and she was going to the mall. I was like, hey, you need 20 bucks. And she's like, no, I got my Target card, my Burger King card, and my Banana Republic card. And I was like, what? Like, there's no such thing as currency to her. Like, and I was just like, it was phenomenal. So what mobile will do one day, and what's really exciting about this, is that it will take all of these virtual currencies, whether it's a World of Warcraft currency or Facebook credits, and enable you to make a checkout. Hopefully, the infrastructure is consolidated, whether it's via Google or via, maybe it's a BlackBerry application or something to that extent, where you can consolidate all this and check out. They gotta give you a come on. Anyway, so fragmentation is a big concern in the infrastructure industry.
So I think we talked about a lot of good things about mobile, financial services. As a consumer, I'm concerned only about 2 things. Right? One is what value prop I'm going to get with mobile money. So I can argue that in certain geographies, certain use cases, there is a value prop. But the second thing that we haven't touched here at all is the counterparty to trust and fraud we talked about was liability. So as a consumer, I am most concerned about liability. So in the current credit card world, I'm very clear that liability doesn't lie with me at all. It is on the issuer. Right? So that was the impetus for people to start using credit card online and elsewhere. It is not clear at all, as some of the panelists mentioned, in the mobile world, who does the liability lie with. So I think to get consumer adoption for goods beyond $100 limits and at the physical retail, we have to solve the problem of liability. In certain places in the US, I think it's clearer because the law forces liability on the issuer. So how do you think, so my question to the panel is, how do you see this liability portion evolve? Because until that is answered, we will not see the adoption as we saw in the physical card world.
So I want to define a concept here. It's called open loop versus closed loop. So open loop means it's like your Visa card or your MasterCard or your even Amex, well, technically not open loop. But basically, when I have money, it's totally fungible, right? You don't have to worry about acceptance. It's going to be accepted places. I can convert it back to cash if I need to. That's where the liability issue is going to be extreme for you as a consumer. And I would say that anybody who's trying to drive adoption in open loop had better do exactly what the card associations did and the banks did, which was take the risk away from the consumer if I expect them to use this, which is what they did, right? You know there's liability limits for you. You know you can call your card company and say that was a fraudulent transaction and they will take care of it for you. So you don't have a lot of personal risk there. And so I think in the open loop space, that's got to happen. If it doesn't happen, I think people won't use it because it'll be too scary for them. The other side of it is in closed loop. And closed loop might be like your Target card where you have $20 on it. In that space, there's actually, the consumer does have the liability. I lose my Target card, I lose my $20. I lose my Metro card, which had $10 on it for BART. I've lost my $10. So in the closed loop gift card space, there's more tolerance for the consumer saying, okay, I'm willing to take the liability myself. But I think for open loop, mobile or cards, it's the same. You've got to have the providers come up and say, we're going to insure you so you don't have to worry about this.
So maybe The question is, in a wallet scenario, who takes the liability?
So one follow-up
The
on
umbrella liability, right?
Well,
So,
I don't think there is
Not
gonna be,
the
I don't
consumer.
think there's gonna be umbrella liability. I think there is going to be, if it remains, there's a question here, I don't want to talk about Kenya too much because it's so far away and everybody says it's different, but, let me just tell you, in Kenya and in Africa, before you had mobile payments, which is real open loop money, right? Before you had that, people had a virtual currency. It happened way before, which was minutes. Minutes had a value, people were able to transfer minutes. It became the continent-wide virtual currency, including nefarious activities, which is another story. But people were able to use that as an electronic currency. It worked, it had a set value. But once people had mobile money, I would say that the virtual currency started to become less valuable for those types of transactions other than calling. People tended to go back to, okay, I can use my phone minutes to make calls, but I'll use my mobile money to do transactions. Now, it could happen differently. There's a lot of virtual currency, and I think it's very exciting in the mobile commerce space what the carrier billing and the virtual currencies are doing. But once you have a trusted way to have your money on your phone for open loop, some of the stuff that currently is being done by closed loop or virtual currency, I would say, is going to become less important. It's just my opinion.
So I have a quick follow-up on that. So I think you made a very good point that, liability needs to be solved. Does that mean that if, so to me it seems like the small companies in this space cannot take that liability on them because, so it has to be a big player, which means quickly we should see consolidation in the mobile payment space for someone to be able to big enough to undertake liability on them.
Or you have to raise a lot of capital. If you're going to be a payment processor, you have to raise a lot of capital. As PayPal founders will tell you, it took $200 million to do it. It takes a lot of money. But I want to say a couple of other things. This fragmentation thing, if you talk to the Japanese, they started NFC, because we in the US think NFC is going to really drive adoption of mobile payments. If you look at the Japanese market, it took them over a decade. And about a year ago, somebody from Dokubo was in my office and they said, we've calculated how much it costs us for every active user that's using mobile payments, open loop mobile payments, which is called, I don't know what they call it now, Felic or whatever. It's $325 a user is the cost that company had to put in to acquire and serve that active customer. That's a lot of money. That doesn't scale in mobile, too much money. And the fragmentation, and there's a ceiling on usage because of this fragmentation issue that was talked about, which is very serious. So I think one of the things we need to think about here is we've got Google and ISIS and Apple and some other players who are all going out and working to drive adoption so that we're going to use our phone instead of our cards or cash at the point of sale. I think that the success, I think the good news is they're spending a lot of money and they're doing some innovative things. The bad news is if it becomes fragmented, it may cost $325 a user to get them to use it, which isn't a good thing economically. So that's where I want to talk about where I think Visa and MasterCard can be a huge enabler for this, because they've already, every merchant that they take both. So you can have that, we understand here having ecosystems that collaborate across competitors in the payment space. So I think we should, the fact that Visa and MasterCard are part of the Google wallet, they'll be part of the, what's the other wallet? ISIS, and VivoTech has also been, we have a chance of preventing the Japanese syndrome, which is fragmentation, which raises costs and actually limits adoption. Limits is the wrong word, but it just inhibits adoption. And we should think about the fact that for this stuff to scale, we really do need to get to sort of cross the traditional competitive boundaries and drive adoption across that area.
Just one quick note. So before you download your Google Wallet, which they have launched, read their T&Cs, terms of service, and read the liability paragraph. And if you can understand without your lawyer, only then download it.
By the way, just to add to that, how do you think, Carol, or in Visa, about virtual currency being more similar to, say, cash, which does not have identity attached to it, versus credit cards? So PayPal being in between, which is partially anonymous, credit cards being, really identity-oriented, and cash having no identity associated with it. So how do you and Visa
PayPal.
or other companies
So,
see
so there's this whole thing around, if it's open loop money, then the actor that issues the vehicle to you has the responsibility, whether it be PayPal or Citibank or Google, whoever's issuing that thing, they have to know who you are. It's called Know Your Customer. And this is a regulated thing. Open loop is a regulated financial service everywhere in the world. So virtual currency doesn't live within that regulated world. But if you go to real money, which the way to identify open loop, I can put value in, I can use it for almost anything money's used for, and then I can reclaim cash, get cash out. That's open loop. The banking regulators in every country will tell you, you have to, whoever's acting in that first, you have to know your customers. So there's a line there that's not going to get fuzzy. But
So
your question about this, what
from
was
a
your question?
customer-
Did you think that
From a customer point of view, do you think there's a demand or there's a space for all three? Or do you feel that's just the way the system has evolved and there's no demand from the customer for an anonymous way to pay?
well, there is an anonymous, the gift cards are that. That's the closed loop thing. Because you have the ability, a Target card, you don't have to know your customer. So we have payment vehicles. But I just want to point out that people underestimate the seriousness of sort of banking regulations in this whole issue. And if currency becomes used, if a virtual currency becomes used in really the way we use real currency, the regulators will come down and impose regulations. It's similar to what happened in Kenya with M-Pesa. It originally was not regulated with open loop. But once it really became used like real electronic money, then the regulators had to step in and do something.
So the great model to study for virtual currency is the QQ coins in China by Tencent is the issuer of that currency. It became so big that it almost posed a threat to the Chinese RMB, and then the government had to come in. But yeah, there is a massive demand for virtual currency. There's various applications where virtual currency makes a lot of sense. Like look at Facebook credits, means we're seeing that it has great adoption. And yeah, there are lots of regulations that come with it because governments are worried about virtual currencies.
So let me take you to, we have been talking about Kenya, and you mentioned that there is a tremendous amount of cash problem in India. And I've been going there for the last 10 years, and every year I go, they say mobile pay is coming. But it has been so slow. So can any one of you give us a little 5-minute understanding of what really is happening in India, what the barriers are, and what the opportunity is for many of us?
So I think India, I'm glad you asked this question because I think India to me is going to be the most exciting mobile payments market on the planet for a lot of reasons. But it has been slow for various reasons, but I think there's two answers to why it's slow. One is the regulations around this were not established until fairly recently. So we went to India in 2007, but basically we had to just kind of spin our wheels for 2 years because there was no banking regulations that would allow us to operate. And so even though we could get a lot of momentum and partnerships and pilots, we couldn't turn it into operation. So that was one of the reasons it was slow. But the other thing to understand is it's a very complicated market with a very large unbanked community. 700 million people don't have bank accounts in India or live in a village that doesn't have a retail bank. So traditional banking doesn't reach people. So you have to deal with bringing lots of people into bank accounts and getting them through the process of signing up for a bank account. That's a huge number of people. The Indian government is so smart about this because they've realized to scale and take advantage of this great opportunity that they have to sort of leapfrog an identification system which doesn't exist. So it costs about $15 today, translated from rupees, to take somebody through the KYC process and get them a bank account. So if you want to walk up and enable your mobile phone to be a bank account, it's about $15. That's way too expensive for 700 million people. And it's even more money in monsoon season because the IDs are wet. And so what India government is sponsoring, and what a multi-billion, there's a guy here who's working on this. They're doing the most exciting project in the world, which is they're saying, we are going to give everybody in India a universal high-tech ID, which is going to be tied to biometrics, it's going to be super safe, and they've got a whole program to get hundreds of millions of people to get these UIDs So once you have that, it'll be like Kenya, where the cost of signing somebody up for a brand new first-time bank account is zero. It's basically they go to the retail store to top up their phone, you upsell them a mobile bank account, but it doesn't cost the retailer very much to do that because they have a way of verifying the person. So as UID gets rolled out, then these 700 people will be easily onboarded onto mobile bank accounts, and the mobile carriers that have large retail networks in India will be able to leverage those retail networks and bring these people into the banking system. So unlike most payment systems, which are merchant-driven, this one is going to be consumer and issuer-driven, because the problem in India with electronic payments is consumers don't have bank accounts. So once they have the bank accounts, then of course the merchants are going to start acceptance, because there's going to be all these people that I can do business with who are remote or local who are going to be able to pay me electronically.
Just a quick time check. We have 5 minutes left, so maybe 3 questions.
So can others tell us what else they see in India?
Well, we're investors in MCheck. That was in some ways a very early player, and I want to completely second the point here. In their case, they started with some of the largest carriers over there, but because they had to limit themselves to folks that already had a banking relationship, that de facto limited them to a very small percentage of the early adopter population. I actually visited India about a year and a half ago, and we met. One of the meetings we had was with the Airtel COO, specifically talking about this initiative, mobile banking, about the opportunities. And at the time, the regulations hadn't been finished, so there was a big question as to were there going to be artificial barriers that would not allow some of the people that de facto held the trust and the cash of a lot of the people, those being the mobile carriers, for whom people even in the most remote village were used to going and depositing money with, if there was going to be an artificial reason somehow not to allow them to operate in this market. And the good news is I think that's been resolved in a good way. And so I think now a lot of the barriers that were there from a sort of timing and adoption perspective are coming down, so I'm very bullish about the Indian market.
I have a question. We talked about mobile wallet, and speaking what you guys already answered is that evidently 3 major players already, ISIS, Google, and iPhone 5 perhaps. So there's fragmentation already to start with. There's no. My thoughts are Apple won't allow Google to have their wallet on an iPhone perhaps. So what is your take? I run an SE startup. I just want to see what possibilities or opportunities do you see in this whole mobile wallet space for a small startup that can operate on different platforms?
Yeah, quick thought here, because when you're dancing with elephants, right? You're talking about large companies, whether it be carriers, banks, or what have you. Tough space to be in and differentiate. I would urge you guys to focus not as much on the plumbing, because I think there's been a lot of very smart people, some of whom are around this panel here, that have been focused on solving the plumbing issue for years, right? Things like fraud, security, what have you. And think more about what could I do if I had this information and the insights in terms of how it could enable new ways of using that information that provide, on the one hand, more incentives for the consumer to use these methods versus others, and on the other hand, for more merchants and marketers to want to use the platform in novel ways, now that you can assume a whole bunch of things like a screen attached to my payment mechanism, things like location knowledge or what have you. So I'm very much about...
So yeah, I would second that. Focus on making the existing wallet smarter, because you won't have the wherewithal to distribute another wallet.
I'd say wallet has now become a big players game. There's a lot of big players, including Visa, that announced wallet. So you should, if I'm an entrepreneur looking at a startup, you should look at wallet as a platform and say, what can I build now around it as an application to make that wallet more usable to a particular demographic or a particular segment of the market. Like when we started PlacePan, we focused on digital goods, knowing that that's the fast-growing market segment, and we completely ignored physical goods. So I think you can have a market segment focus, and you can have a specific applications around it.
Go ahead.
So in India and all, there are obstacles to spending your money. But here, can you talk about? See, credit card is not a replacement for cash. It was extension of my spending limit. So when you look at mobile, is there any way it's going to increase my spending limit or the consumer spending limit? So can you talk about some ideas on that mobile wallet, which will really be, benefits to me in the pocket?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. A good example is I have an aunt in India who tried to buy a learning tool for her son online, and took her 3 physical trips and 7 days to make the purchase, which was about $4 US. So she made it fun and bought ice cream every time for her son, but it was amazing that she wanted to spend money but couldn't. What you'll see is, I think again, this notion if you have identity, I think to us starting with the SIM card, phone number, other forms of identity, it becomes an underwritable moment. One funny stat about the US is only 30% of transactions actually need to be underwritten in the US. So every time you use your credit card, you actually could have paid in cash. The money was in your account, but the networks are forcing a loan. In India, every single one of those opportunities could have been an underwriting event. So I actually looked at her situation. The ISP she was with for 7 years, and she paid her bill on time every month. That ISP could have underwritten that transaction, so she could just simply put her phone number into the website. So I think that banks want to underwrite, at least maybe they've done too much of that in some ways. But that's their role in life. Ultimately is to offer credit. And I think we've gone to a point where in the US we're offering credit in lots of places where we don't need. Walmart today represents 12% of merchant acquisition. If tomorrow they decide to become a big player in merchant acquisition and become 50, 60%, they can just force all the networks to say, you know what, no more interchange, it's 25 cents, that's all we're willing to pay. But that becomes an option to underwrite the actual person who needs the money. Every time I buy a cup of coffee and I use my Amex card, I don't need to wait 30 days to pay for that. But there's other people, like my aunt in India, that could use that underwriting instead.
Carriers today are already credit lending facilities, right? So you have a $100 phone bill which you pay at the end of the month, and so they already understand that this is an issue that they have, and I think going forward, as they lend more credit per se through carrier billing, through us, or maybe it's even through a Google Wallet or an Apple or per se, they will be regulated and they'll be very secure in watching how much they do this. But they are cognizant of that, and I think as those limits increase, you'll see government, you'll see banks, and et cetera, get involved in that process as well. So I do think you'll see movement that way.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So if there are more questions, perhaps people can catch the panelists after this. So we have a short video, Naveed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, before we close, I'll figure out how we... So we just wanted to show you a quick video. As well. Anyway, now you will have the panelists over here if you guys want to interact, and after that,
What is the word?
In India.
Space for the mobile phones. What is the startup? So where do you live?
San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so